Some doors are locked for a reason, but sometimes the one who keeps opening them is not human at all. Winter settled over Hawthorne Castle like a silver blanket, softening its towering stone walls beneath fresh snow while icy winds swept across the surrounding cliffs. Travelers often admired the castle from miles away, but few ever crossed its gates without feeling the quiet weight of history hidden within those ancient halls. Claire Bennett certainly felt it. She had never imagined that a rejected Omega from a forgotten village would receive an invitation to restore the castle's neglected royal library, yet the handwritten letter bearing the Hawthorne seal had arrived only a week before, offering honest work through the winter season. She accepted immediately. Opportunities rarely knock twice for someone like her. The servants greeted Claire politely enough, though curiosity lingered in their eyes as they escorted her through endless corridors lined with portraits of generations of Alpha rulers. Every polished floor reflected candlelight. Every tall window framed endless forests covered in snow. The castle was magnificent, but it also felt strangely lonely, as though too many rooms had forgotten the sound of laughter. "Your room is in the East Wing," the elderly housekeeper explained while handing Claire a small brass key. "It is quiet there. You should sleep well." Claire smiled gratefully. "Quiet sounds perfect." The woman hesitated for the briefest moment before adding, "If you hear unusual sounds during the night, do not be alarmed. Castles have a way of settling in the cold." Claire assumed she meant old wooden beams shifting beneath winter weather. She thanked the housekeeper and carried her small suitcase upstairs without another thought. Her room overlooked a frozen garden where bare trees reached toward the moonlit sky like delicate sketches drawn in silver. Inside, a crackling fireplace chased away the evening chill, and neatly folded blankets rested upon a comfortable bed that looked far softer than anything Claire had known for years. She unpacked only a few belongings: a worn notebook, 2 favorite novels, a knitted scarf made by her grandmother long before she passed away. The familiar objects made the unfamiliar room feel a little more like home. After a simple supper shared with the kitchen staff, Claire spent several hours dusting forgotten shelves inside the enormous library until her eyes grew heavy. By the time she returned to her room, the castle had fallen completely silent. Snow drifted gently beyond the window, and somewhere far below, the great clock announced midnight with 12 slow chimes. Claire whispered goodnight to the empty room, smiled at her own habit, and slipped beneath the warm blankets. Sleep came almost immediately. Then something soft brushed against the edge of the mattress. Claire stirred, but did not fully wake. A second gentle movement followed, accompanied by the faint sound of careful paws landing upon thick carpet. Half asleep, she opened her eyes just enough to see an enormous black wolf standing quietly beside her bed. Moonlight poured through the window, outlining its thick fur and silver. The animal did not growl. It did not bare its teeth. Instead, it calmly rested its chin on the mattress, as though asking permission. Claire should have screamed. She should have reached for the bell beside the fireplace. Instead, the deep golden eyes looking back at her held no trace of menace, only an odd familiarity that made fear impossible. Without thinking, she slowly lifted one hand. The great wolf lowered its head until her fingers rested gently against the soft fur behind one ear. It released a quiet breath that sounded almost relieved before carefully climbing onto the wide bed. Rather than lying beside her, it curled into a neat circle at the foot of the blankets, closed its eyes, and within moments appeared peacefully asleep. Claire stared in complete disbelief, wondering if she was still dreaming. Yet when she finally drifted back to sleep, the comforting warmth of thick black fur remained quietly at the end of her bed, as though the mysterious visitor had always believed it belonged there. Claire woke to pale winter sunlight spilling across the blankets and instinctively looked toward the foot of the bed. It was empty. The thick black wolf had vanished, without leaving so much as a single strand of fur behind. She sat upright, convinced the entire night had been nothing more than an unusually vivid dream until she noticed faint paw prints pressed into the thin layer of frost that had formed along the inside edge of the open balcony door. Her heartbeat quickened. She distinctly remembered locking that door before climbing into bed. Slowly, she crossed the room and found the latch resting open. A rush of icy air drifted inside, carrying the clean scent of pine and fresh snow. Claire stepped onto the balcony, but the courtyard below remained quiet except for servants beginning their morning routines. No enormous wolf could have crossed the open grounds unnoticed. After closing the door again, she laughed softly at herself. Maybe castles really do have strange dreams. The words sounded far less convincing than she hoped. Breakfast was served in a bright dining hall overlooking the eastern gardens. Claire quietly joined the long wooden table reserved for castle staff, grateful to disappear into the background as conversations drifted around her. Halfway through the meal, the atmosphere changed without warning. Every servant stood at once. Chairs slid quietly across polished stone as respectful silence filled the room. Claire looked toward the entrance, just as a tall man stepped inside wearing a charcoal coat trimmed with silver embroidery. His dark hair was neatly combed, and calm gray eyes acknowledged the room with a simple nod before he accepted a cup of coffee from a steward. No one needed to announce who he was. Authority surrounded him as naturally as breathing. Alpha King Sebastian Hawthorne carried himself without unnecessary display, speaking little while offering polite thanks to every servant who greeted him. Claire lowered her eyes, hoping not to attract attention. She had expected someone distant and intimidating, yet the ruler standing only a few yards away appeared thoughtful rather than severe. An older groundskeeper cleared his throat carefully. "Your Majesty, forgive my curiosity, but has Lord Nix returned?" Sebastian paused before answering. "Not yet." Another servant smiled knowingly. "He disappeared again last night." A faint expression crossed the Alpha King's face, somewhere between resignation and amusement. He has always preferred making his own decisions. Several people chuckled quietly, as though the answer explained everything. Claire looked up, without meaning to. Lord Nix. The name lingered in her thoughts. Could they possibly be talking about the same black wolf that had slept at the foot of her bed? Before she could dismiss the idea as impossible, Sebastian glanced briefly toward the frost still clinging to the sleeves of her coat. "You are our new librarian." It was not a question. Claire quickly stood. "Yes, Your Majesty. Claire Bennett." He inclined his head politely. "I hope the East Wing was comfortable." She hesitated for only a heartbeat. Very comfortable. The memory of warm black fur resting across the end of her bed flashed through her mind, but she kept it to herself. Sebastian offered a courteous smile. "Good. The castle can feel unfamiliar at first." With that, he continued through the hall, leaving behind little more than the quiet scent of cedar and winter air. Claire watched him disappear through the doorway before returning to her breakfast. Across the room, two young maids whispered to one another. "Lord Nix always vanishes on the coldest nights," one murmured. "Then he comes back before sunrise as though nothing happened." The other nodded. "No one has ever figured out where he goes." Claire stared down at her untouched cup of tea. Somewhere deep inside the castle, a clock chimed the beginning of a new hour, and for reasons she could not explain, she suddenly found herself wondering whether the mysterious wolf would return again when night fell. The rest of the day passed quietly among towering bookshelves that had not been touched in decades. Dust shimmered through narrow beams of winter sunlight while Claire carefully sorted faded journals, repaired cracked bindings, and arranged forgotten volumes according to handwritten records older than anyone still working in the castle. She found comfort in the silence. Books had always been kinder than people. They never judged where she came from or reminded her that she was an Omega who had never truly belonged anywhere. Every so often, however, she caught herself glancing toward the tall library windows overlooking the snowy gardens, wondering if a pair of golden eyes might be watching from somewhere beyond the glass. By evening, her shoulders ached pleasantly from honest work. One of the kitchen servants smiled as she handed Claire a bowl of hot vegetable soup and a slice of fresh bread. "You must be settling in well," the woman said kindly. Claire returned the smile. "Everyone has been very welcoming." The servant laughed softly. "Wait until the castle decides it likes you." Claire almost asked what that meant, but the woman had already hurried away carrying another tray. Later, wrapped in the familiar warmth of her room, Claire sat beside the fireplace reading one of the old novels she had brought from home. Outside, snow drifted gently across the balcony, turning the garden below into a quiet sea of silver. The great clock announced midnight once again. Claire closed her book, extinguished the bedside candle, and slipped beneath the blankets. This time she told herself firmly that if a giant black wolf appeared again, she would remain perfectly calm and prove to herself that she had imagined everything the night before. She did not have to wait long. A soft click came from the balcony door. Claire opened her eyes. The latch slowly lifted by itself before the door eased inward just enough to allow a swirl of icy air into the room. A familiar black shape slipped gracefully through the opening. The enormous wolf padded silently across the carpet before stopping beside the bed. Moonlight reflected inside its golden eyes, giving them a warm glow rather than anything frightening. Claire sighed, somewhere between disbelief and acceptance. "You came back." The wolf gave a slow blink, almost as though it understood every word. Instead of climbing onto the bed immediately, it lowered its head politely, waiting. Claire could not explain why, but the gesture reminded her of someone asking permission before entering another person's home. "I suppose this means you are very well-mannered," she whispered with a smile. "All right." The great wolf carefully climbed onto the mattress, circled twice, and settled once again at the foot of the bed exactly where it had slept before. Claire pulled the blankets closer around herself and watched the animal for several quiet minutes. Its breathing gradually slowed into the peaceful rhythm of deep sleep. She reached toward the small table beside her bed and picked up the novel she had been reading earlier. "If you insist on visiting every night," she murmured playfully, "you might as well listen to a story." The wolf lifted one ear without opening its eyes. Claire smiled and began reading aloud in a calm, gentle voice. The words floated softly through the room while the fire crackled nearby. Every chapter seemed to relax the mysterious visitor even more. By the time she reached the end of the first chapter, the great wolf had stretched comfortably across the blankets with a quiet, contented sigh. Claire closed the book, amused by her unusual audience. "You really do like stories." Just before sleep claimed her, she noticed something she had missed the night before. Around the wolf's neck rested a finely crafted leather collar bearing a small silver crest shaped like a soaring hawk surrounded by a crescent moon. She had seen that same symbol earlier that day engraved above the throne in the great hall. Her heartbeat slowed as a single impossible thought crossed her mind. Somehow, the quiet visitor sleeping peacefully at the end of her bed belonged far closer to the Alpha King than anyone in the castle seemed willing to explain. By the fourth morning, Claire had stopped asking herself whether the mysterious visitor was real. The answer greeted her every sunrise in the faint impressions left across the blankets at the foot of her bed and in the lingering scent of pine carried in from the open balcony. Yet no matter how carefully she searched, the great wolf always disappeared before the castle fully awakened. It became their silent routine, one that belonged only to the quiet hours between midnight and dawn. During the day, Claire immersed herself in restoring the royal library, carefully cataloging weathered manuscripts whose pages had curled with age. While examining a collection of journals written by former palace historians, she noticed an old illustration carved into one brittle page. It depicted a magnificent black wolf resting beside an ancient alpha ruler beneath a crescent moon. The crest around the wolf's neck was identical to the one she had seen on her nightly visitor. Before she could study the faded notes beneath the drawing, the library doors opened. Sebastian Hawthorne stepped inside, carrying a single leather-bound volume. "I hope I am not interrupting," he said politely. Claire quickly stood. "Not at all, Your Majesty." He placed the book gently upon the desk. "This belonged to my grandfather. I thought it deserved a place among the restored collection." As Claire accepted the volume, she noticed something unusual. A few long strands of dark fur clung quietly to the sleeve of Sebastian's charcoal coat. They matched the color of the wolf's thick winter coat almost perfectly. She hesitated before brushing one loose with gentle fingers. "You have a little fur on your sleeve." Sebastian glanced down, looking almost surprised.
Doi.
His expression softened into a faint smile. "Nick sheds far more than anyone would expect." Claire smiled politely, though curiosity continued growing inside her. He must spend a great deal of time with you. Sebastian paused just long enough for the silence to become noticeable.
Not always, he answered at last.
Lately, he has developed unusual habits. Claire tilted her head slightly. Such as? A quiet chuckle escaped him, disappearing every night without explanation. She lowered her eyes to hide the unexpected warmth spreading across her face. Perhaps he enjoys exploring. Perhaps. Sebastian looked toward the tall windows where fresh snow drifted beyond the glass. Or perhaps instincts sometimes know places that reason cannot explain. The words lingered in Claire's thoughts long after he quietly left the library. That evening a fierce winter wind swept across the castle, rattling old windows and filling empty corridors with soft echoes. Several servants hurried to secure shutters before another snowstorm arrived. Claire returned to her room earlier than usual, wrapping herself in a knitted blanket while reading beside the fireplace. She wondered whether the worsening weather would keep the mysterious wolf away. Midnight came and passed. For the first time since her arrival, the balcony remained closed and perfectly still. Claire told herself she should feel relieved. Instead, she found the room strangely empty. She had almost drifted to sleep when 3 gentle taps sounded against the balcony glass. She sat upright immediately. Outside, snow swirled so heavily that the garden had nearly disappeared beneath the storm. Standing just beyond the frosted door was the great black wolf, its thick fur dusted with snowflakes and its golden eyes watching her patiently. Claire hurried across the room and opened the door without thinking. A burst of icy air swept inside as the wolf stepped gracefully over the threshold before shaking snow from its coat. "You waited outside because the door was locked," she whispered with an embarrassed laugh. The wolf looked at her quietly, then walked past without the slightest hesitation, circled once at the foot of her bed, and settled into its familiar place with a contented sigh. Claire smiled as she closed the balcony door against the storm. Somewhere else in the castle, at that exact moment, Sebastian Hawthorne suddenly paused in the middle of reviewing official documents, staring absently toward the east wing before murmuring to himself with quiet resignation, "Instincts again." The snowstorm continued through the next day, wrapping Hawthorne Castle in a quiet world of white where even distant towers faded behind curtains of falling snow. Claire spent the morning beside the tall library windows, carefully restoring a collection of weathered maps while the fire crackled softly nearby. Every so often she found herself glancing toward the courtyard, wondering whether Lord Nix preferred running through storms or waiting patiently for clear skies. She smiled at the thought before quickly returning to her work. By late afternoon the wind grew stronger, and servants hurried through the corridors carrying extra blankets and firewood. One elderly maid paused beside Claire with a warm cup of tea. "The East Wing can feel lonely during storms," she said kindly. "If you need anything, simply ring the bell." Claire thanked her with genuine gratitude. "Everyone here has been far kinder than I expected." The woman smiled knowingly. Kindness has a way of finding those who still believe in it. That evening the storm became the fiercest anyone had seen that winter. Snow piled high against the castle walls while gusts of wind hummed softly through the ancient stone corridors. Claire settled into bed earlier than usual, expecting that even her mysterious visitor might remain somewhere warmer until morning. Midnight arrived. The room stayed perfectly still. She listened to the fire, the wind, and the faint ticking of the old clock on the mantel. Somehow the silence disappointed her more than she cared to admit. Just as she closed her eyes, a familiar sound reached her ears. 3 gentle taps touched the balcony glass. Claire smiled before she even opened her eyes. She crossed the room and pulled the door inward. A swirl of snow rushed inside, followed by the great black wolf stepping gracefully across the threshold. Thick flakes clung to its fur, sparkling beneath the firelight. "You look freezing," Claire whispered with quiet concern. She fetched a large towel from beside the washstand and hesitated only briefly before gently drying the snow from the wolf's shoulders. The enormous animal remained perfectly still, lowering its head slightly as though grateful for the attention. "There," she said softly. "Much better." When she finished, the wolf gave a slow shake, then unexpectedly nudged the folded blanket resting on the nearby chair. Claire laughed. "You have opinions now?" The wolf looked toward the blanket again. She picked it up and spread it neatly across the foot of the bed. Satisfied, the great animal climbed onto its familiar place, curled into a comfortable circle, and rested its head upon the fresh blanket with an unmistakably content expression. Claire could not help smiling. "You truly have made yourself at home." She returned to her own pillow and opened another chapter of her favorite novel, reading aloud while the wolf quietly listened, with half-closed golden eyes. Before long, its breathing slowed into peaceful sleep. The room felt warmer than ever despite the storm outside. Dawn arrived much too quickly. Claire woke to find the blanket neatly folded once again, the bed empty, and the balcony door standing slightly open. She stepped toward the fireplace to add another log, but suddenly noticed something draped carefully across the chair beside it. It was a heavy charcoal cloak embroidered with a silver hawk and crescent moon, still carrying the faint warmth and cedar scent she had come to recognize during breakfast whenever Alpha King Sebastian Hawthorne entered the dining hall. Claire touched the fabric in quiet confusion. She was certain the cloak had not been there before she fell asleep. At that same moment, across the castle, Sebastian paused outside the council chamber, looked down at his winter clothes, and realized with visible surprise that his favorite cloak had somehow vanished during the night once again. Claire carefully folded the charcoal cloak before carrying it downstairs, determined to return it before anyone assumed she had taken it by mistake. The silver hawk clasp caught the morning light as she walked through the quiet corridors, and more than one servant glanced at it with surprised expressions before quickly looking away. By the time she reached the dining hall, breakfast had already begun. Alpha King Sebastian Hawthorne stood near the long windows speaking softly with two advisors, yet Claire immediately noticed something unusual. Instead of his familiar charcoal cloak, he wore a simple dark wool coat that seemed almost plain by comparison. As though sensing her presence, Sebastian turned. His calm gray eyes settled briefly on the folded garment in her hands before a flicker of genuine surprise crossed his face. Claire approached respectfully. "Your Majesty, I believe this belongs to you." Sebastian looked at the cloak for a long moment before accepting it with quiet gratitude. "Thank you, Miss Bennett." He ran one hand across the silver clasp almost absently. "I was wondering where it had disappeared to." One of the younger advisors smiled with restrained amusement. "Again?" Sebastian answered with a nearly imperceptible sigh. "Again." Claire hesitated before speaking. "I found it in my room this morning. I assumed one of the servants had accidentally left it there." For the briefest instant, the two advisors exchanged a knowing glance, but neither interrupted. Sebastian simply nodded. "The castle has a way of moving unexpected things from time to time." His answer sounded perfectly reasonable, yet something in his expression suggested he did not entirely believe his own explanation. Throughout the day, whispers floated gently through the castle without ever becoming unkind. A pair of young maids quietly discussed how the Alpha King's cloak had disappeared after another night when Lord Nyx had once again been impossible to find. An elderly steward chuckled softly while polishing silver trays. "First the wolf disappears. Then the cloak disappears. One day, perhaps they will both decide to stay in the same place." Claire pretended not to hear, although every passing conversation deepened the strange mystery surrounding her nightly visitor. That afternoon, she returned to the library, where she discovered Sebastian already standing before one of the tallest shelves studying an old collection of star charts. He looked unusually thoughtful. "I hope the restoration is not becoming overwhelming," he said without turning around. "Not at all," Claire replied. "I enjoy bringing forgotten things back to life." Sebastian smiled faintly. "That is a rare gift." A comfortable silence settled between them as they examined the aging books. Finally, Claire spoke the question that had lingered in her thoughts for days. "Your Majesty, may I ask something?" He nodded. "Of course. Does Lord Nyx always sleep wherever he chooses?" Sebastian's expression changed almost too quickly to notice. He closed the book in his hands before answering with careful honesty. "More often than I would like to admit." Claire looked down at the worn wooden floor. "He seems very gentle." A quiet laugh escaped Sebastian. That depends entirely on where his instincts decide to lead him. He spoke the final word with a mixture of resignation and curiosity, as though it remained an unsolved puzzle even to him. Claire considered telling him everything about the wolf's nightly visits, the story she read aloud, and the peaceful way it curled at the foot of her bed. Yet something inside urged her to wait. The secret did not feel dangerous. It felt strangely precious. As evening settled once again over Hawthorne Castle, Sebastian stood alone on a balcony, overlooking the snow-covered gardens. Far below, he noticed the soft glow of candlelight appearing in the east wing where Claire's room overlooked the frozen grounds. Without realizing it, his attention lingered there several moments, longer than intended. He quietly shook his head, almost amused with himself, before murmuring beneath his breath, "Whatever my wolf is searching for, he refuses to give up." The quiet mystery that had begun to weave itself through Hawthorne Castle no longer belonged only to Claire. It had quietly found its way into Sebastian's thoughts as well. Every morning he woke in his own chamber feeling unusually rested, yet unable to remember how the final hours of each night had passed. His attendants politely ignored the strange pattern, although they could not help noticing that Lord Nix was never found inside the royal quarters until just before sunrise. The great wolf always returned calm, content, and carrying the faint scent of old books, fireplace smoke, and lavender. Sebastian understood every habit his wolf had ever shown throughout the years, yet this one remained impossible to explain. During a meeting with his senior advisors that afternoon, maps and reports covered the long council table, but Sebastian's attention wandered more than once toward the snow-covered eastern wing visible through the tall windows. One advisor finally smiled. "Your Majesty, you have looked outside 4 times in the last 10 minutes. Sebastian glanced back at the documents with quiet embarrassment. "Have I?" The older advisor folded his hands thoughtfully. "Does this have anything to do with Lord Nix disappearing every evening?" Sebastian released a slow breath before answering honestly. "Perhaps." The room grew comfortably silent. "I have never forced my wolf to ignore his instincts," Sebastian continued. "Until now they have always served us well." "And now?" the advisor asked gently. Sebastian looked toward the drifting snow beyond the glass. "Now they lead somewhere I cannot explain." That evening Claire finished organizing the final shelf of ancient poetry before carrying a stack of restored books back to the library archives. She found herself smiling when she noticed she had begun leaving an extra folded blanket at the foot of her bed every night without even thinking about it. The realization made her laugh softly. "You are becoming predictable," she whispered to herself, though she was not certain whether she meant the mysterious wolf or her own growing anticipation. After supper, she selected another novel, lit the fireplace, and settled into the familiar quiet of her room. Outside, the storm had finally passed, leaving the moon bright against a sky filled with countless stars. Midnight arrived with its gentle chime. Moments later came the now familiar sound of careful paws crossing the balcony. Claire opened the door before the first tap could reach the glass. The great black wolf stood waiting beneath the moonlight, looking almost surprised that she had greeted it so quickly. "I thought I might save you the trouble tonight," she said with a warm smile. The wolf stepped inside, brushed lightly against her shoulder in quiet greeting, and walked directly toward the bed. Before curling into its usual place, however, it paused beside her for several long seconds. Claire reached up instinctively and rested one hand against the thick fur beneath its neck. "You seem tired." The wolf closed its eyes for a brief moment, leaning gently into her touch before settling comfortably onto the folded blanket. Claire resumed reading aloud, her voice soft enough to blend with the crackling fire. As the story unfolded, the wolf's breathing gradually slowed into peaceful sleep. Miles away from any battlefield, surrounded by nothing more than old books and quiet kindness, the Alpha King's powerful wolf looked more at peace than it ever had inside the grand royal chambers. At nearly the same moment, Sebastian suddenly awoke in his own bed just before dawn with an unfamiliar warmth lingering in his chest and the unmistakable feeling that someone had been reading to him, though the room around him remained completely empty except for the fading scent of lavender carried by the first morning breeze. The following morning, Hawthorne Castle welcomed an unexpected visitor whose arrival quietly altered the rhythm of every corridor. The Moon Priestess had come from the northern sanctuary to bless the castle before the winter solstice, and even the oldest servants greeted her with deep respect. Claire met the elderly woman only briefly while carrying a stack of restored manuscripts across the great hall. The priestess paused, studying her with kind silver eyes before smiling as though recognizing someone she had expected to meet. "You have brought light into a lonely place," she said gently. Claire blinked in surprise. "I only repair old books." The priestess's smile deepened. Sometimes hearts are restored long before libraries. Before Claire could ask what she meant, the elderly woman continued toward the royal chapel with slow, graceful steps. Those mysterious words stayed with Claire throughout the day. That afternoon, Sebastian requested several historical records concerning ancient moon bonds, claiming he wished to compare ceremonial traditions before the coming festival. Claire gathered the requested volumes and personally delivered them to his private study. When she entered, she found maps, journals, and handwritten notes spread neatly across a large oak desk. Sebastian looked unusually thoughtful. "Thank you," he said warmly as she placed the books beside him. One open page caught Claire's attention before she could politely look away. It contained an illustration of an alpha standing beside a black wolf while a crescent moon glowed overhead. Beneath the drawing, a single sentence had been carefully written by an unknown scholar many generations earlier. "The wolf recognizes what the heart has not yet accepted." Claire quietly read the words without fully understanding them. Sebastian noticed where her eyes had fallen and closed the book with a gentle motion. "Old legends," he said, softly. "Most people believe they are only stories." Claire smiled. "Stories often survive because they carry a little truth." Their eyes met for a brief moment before both looked away almost at the same time. That evening, the Moon Priestess joined the royal family for supper. Conversation remained pleasant until one of the younger nobles laughingly mentioned Lord Nix's recent habit of disappearing every night. "Perhaps he has found a secret hunting ground," someone suggested. The priestess simply stirred her tea before looking toward Sebastian. "Wolves rarely lose their way," she said calmly, "especially not royal ones." Sebastian smiled politely. "He follows his instincts." The elderly woman nodded as though she had expected exactly that answer. "Yes," she replied, "he does." Nothing more was said, yet the quiet certainty in her voice lingered long after the meal ended. Near midnight, Claire settled into bed with another novel resting open in her lap. The familiar tapping never came. Instead, when she opened the balcony door, the great black wolf was already sitting patiently outside beneath the moonlight, gazing at the stars before turning toward her with gentle golden eyes. "Were you enjoying the view?" she asked with a soft laugh. The wolf rose gracefully and stepped inside, brushing lightly against her hand before curling into its familiar place at the foot of the bed. Claire resumed reading aloud while absent-mindedly resting one hand against the thick black fur. The wolf sighed contentedly without opening its eyes. At that very hour, the Moon Priestess quietly crossed an upper balcony overlooking the east wing. She paused beside Sebastian, who stood alone watching snow drift through the moonlight. Without looking at him, she said, "Your Majesty, there are truths that the wolf understands long before the man is willing to admit them." Sebastian remained silent for several moments before releasing a thoughtful breath. "I keep telling everyone it is only instinct." The priestess smiled gently toward the warm glow coming from Claire's window below. "Perhaps," she whispered, "but instincts are often the first language spoken by destiny." Winter slowly gave way to the first gentle signs of spring, and with each passing morning Hawthorne Castle felt a little less silent than before. The restored library welcomed sunlight through polished windows, its shelves once again filled with carefully preserved stories instead of forgotten dust. Claire often smiled as she arranged the final volumes, realizing that she had not only repaired old books, but had somehow brought warmth back into a place that had quietly forgotten how to feel alive. Sebastian found more reasons than necessary to visit the library, sometimes carrying a single book that did not truly need returning, other times asking simple questions whose answers he already knew. Neither of them rushed the quiet friendship growing between them. It unfolded naturally, built from shared conversations, peaceful afternoons, and comfortable silences. Lord Nyx never stopped visiting Claire's room. Every evening, after the castle settled into stillness, the great black wolf would gently scratch against the balcony door before curling up at the foot of her bed exactly as it had from the beginning. Claire no longer questioned the strange routine. She simply placed an extra folded blanket there each night and continued reading stories aloud until the wolf drifted peacefully to sleep. One afternoon, the Moon Priestess prepared to leave the castle. Before stepping into her carriage, she found Sebastian standing near the entrance, watching the eastern wing where Claire worked beside an open window. "Have you finally found your answer?" she asked gently. Sebastian smiled with quiet honesty. "I spent weeks telling everyone that my wolf was following instinct." The priestess waited patiently. He looked toward the library, where Claire laughed softly after discovering an amusing note hidden inside an old manuscript. "Now, I believe my wolf understood something long before I did." The elderly woman nodded as though nothing could have been more natural. The heart often arrives after the first step has already been taken. That evening, Sebastian climbed the familiar staircase leading toward the east wing. For the first time, he stopped outside Claire's door before midnight instead of waking. Later, with only scattered memories. He knocked softly. Claire opened the door with a welcoming smile. Behind her, Lord Nyx was already resting comfortably on the folded blanket, lazily lifting one ear at the sound of his master's footsteps. Sebastian looked at the peaceful wolf before meeting Claire's eyes. "May I come in?" he asked. "Of course," she answered warmly. He stepped inside, noticing the familiar novel resting open beside the fireplace. "So this is where he keeps disappearing." Claire laughed quietly. "He seems to enjoy bedtime stories." Sebastian looked at Nyx, who responded by stretching comfortably without the slightest intention of leaving. The Alpha King shook his head with amused surrender. "I have argued with him for weeks," he admitted. "He never listened." Claire smiled. "Perhaps he was trying to tell you something." Sebastian nodded slowly. "I think he was." They sat together beside the fire, while Claire continued reading another chapter. Nyx slept peacefully between them, completely content with the simple scene he had quietly created night after night. When the final page was finished, neither Claire nor Sebastian spoke immediately. The silence felt gentle, familiar, and wonderfully unforced. Outside, the last traces of winter melted beneath the moonlight, and inside the castle the lonely rooms no longer echoed with emptiness. Sometimes destiny did not arrive with dramatic declarations or impossible miracles. Sometimes it simply arrived one quiet night at a time, carried by the faithful instincts of a gentle wolf who knew exactly where home had always been.